The cul-de-sac looks like the safest street in America. Picture it, a quiet curving lane with no traffic running through it, a ring of tidy houses, kids on bikes, dads washing cars in the driveway. The cul-de-sac is the crown jewel of 1950s suburban Americana architecture, and for 70 years we have sold it as the happiest place a family could ever live. But here is the thing nobody put in the brochure. The exact shape of the cul-de-sac, the very layout that was supposed to protect you, was quietly doing something to the human brain. It was rewiring how people connect, and it helped set off a psychological crisis that we are still living inside of today. This is not a ghost story, and it is not a conspiracy. It is the science of isolation. And once you see how this street was actually built, you will never look at your own neighborhood the same way again. So stay with me, because the dark side of the American dream is hiding in plain sight, right at the end of the block. Let me start with what the cul-de-sac was supposed to be, because the intentions really were good. After the Second World War, millions of soldiers came home, got married, and wanted a house, a yard, and a safe place to raise kids all at once. The answer was the suburb, and the design that came to define it was the dead-end street, curled into that little teardrop shape with the houses wrapped around the bottom. The whole point was safety. No cars cut through a cul-de-sac because the road goes nowhere. There is no reason to drive down it unless you live there. So the traffic disappears, the street gets quiet, and your children can play in it. On paper, it is genius. And it was not an accident. This was engineered deliberately by some of the smartest planners of the century. The idea goes back to a town in New Jersey called Radburn, designed in 1929 by two architects named Clarence Stein and Henry Whyte, where planners set out to do one specific thing: separate the human being from the automobile. Radburn itself was inspired by an earlier dream, the Garden City movement, a philosophy started in England by Ebenezer Howard that imagined planned communities blending the best of town and country living. Stein and Wright took that idealism and turned it into something concrete. They built superblocks ringed by these dead-end lanes, pushing the cars to the edges and giving people the quiet interior. After the war, the federal government fell in love with the concept. The Federal Housing Administration, the agency that backed the home loans for all those new houses, actively encouraged the curving street and the cul-de-sac over the old-fashioned grid, and a builder could lose his financing if he ignored the guidance. And builders like William Levitt, the man behind the famous Levittowns, turned it into an assembly line, stamping out thousands of nearly identical homes on thousands of these gentle, looping streets. There was even a writer named William Whyte who went and lived in one of these brand new communities, a place called Park Forest outside Chicago, and wrote a landmark book about what he found there. He described a whole class of people he called the organization man, friendly, comfortable, and quietly pressured to think, buy, and live exactly like everyone else on the block. The cul-de-sac was not just a design choice, it became the official blueprint of the American dream, conformity and all. Now here is where the trouble starts, and it is the kind of trouble you cannot see, which is exactly why it went on for decades. The cul-de-sac was built to keep something out. It was built to keep out cars, and it succeeded. But a street that is hard for a car to enter is also a street that is hard for a person to stumble into. Think about how an old neighborhood actually works. On a regular city grid, you are constantly accidentally bumping into people. You walk to the corner store and you pass 3 neighbors. You wait at the bus stop with the same faces. The mailman, the shopkeeper, the kid down the block, they all cross your path whether you planned it or not. Those tiny, unplanned, almost meaningless encounters are not meaningless at all. They are the glue, They are how a human being feels woven into a place. A brilliant observer of cities named Jane Jacobs wrote about this in 1961, and she had a perfect phrase for it. She called it eyes on the street, the constant casual web of people watching out for one another simply by being present and going about their day. That web is what makes a place feel alive and safe. An architect named Oscar Newman later built on this same idea with his theory of defensible space, arguing that neighborhood design itself shapes whether people feel ownership over their surroundings and look out for one another. And the cul-de-sac, for all its quiet, has almost no eyes on the street at all, because there is almost no street life to have eyes on. The cul-de-sac quietly deletes every one of them. There is no through traffic, which means there are no passers-by. There is nowhere to walk to because the store is a car ride away and there is often no sidewalk to get you there anyway. You pull your car out of the garage, the door rolls down behind you, you drive to work, you drive home, and the door rolls back up. You can live on a friendly-looking street for years and barely learn the names of the people 3 doors down. The suburban design that gave you safety and silence took something in exchange, and what it took was the steady, casual human contact that the brain actually runs on. We are wired, deep down, as a social species. We need the herd in our peripheral vision, and the cul-de-sac, without meaning to, built a beautiful little cage around each family and called it freedom. And the people who first felt the weight of that cage were the women. The men at least left every morning. They drove out to an office, a factory, a city full of other people, and came home at night. But the housewife stayed behind in the quiet, in a house full of brand new labor-saving machines, on a street where there was no one to talk to and nowhere to go. And what happened to her was so common that doctors actually gave it a name, long before the American suburb even hit its peak. Back in 1938, a British physician named Stephen Taylor wrote it up in the famous medical journal, the Lancet, and called it the suburban neurosis. He described an isolated, anxious, deeply unhappy woman surrounded by comfort and conveniences and slowly going to pieces inside it. That was the warning, and it was published before the war even started. Nobody listened. The suburbs exploded anyway, and a generation later, an American writer named Betty Friedan put her finger on the exact same wound. In her famous book in 1963, she described the quiet desperation of the suburban housewife and called it the problem that has no name. Millions of women read it and felt seen for the first time because they had all been told that this street, this house, this life was the dream, and they could not understand why, in the middle of the dream, they felt so empty and so alone. So what do you do with a whole population that is anxious and isolated and cannot say why? In the 1950s, America found an answer in a pill. In 1955, a drug called Miltown hit the market, the first true blockbuster tranquilizer in American history. It promised to take the edge off, to make the worry go quiet, and the country swallowed it by the ton. The numbers are staggering. By the end of the very next year, it is estimated that about 1 in 20 Americans had already tried it. It got so fashionable that people joked about dropping it into a cocktail. Then came an even bigger one. In 1963, a drug called Valium arrived, and it became the best-selling pill in the country for years, so tied to the exhausted suburban wife that the Rolling Stones wrote a hit song, Mother's Little Helper, about a worn-out housewife reaching for a little yellow pill just to get through her day. A neighborhood design built for happiness had quietly become a neighborhood design that needed medicating. Now, I want to be careful and fair here because this is where the science really matters and where it is easy to go too far. The cul-de-sac did not single-handedly break anyone's mind. People are complicated, and so are the times they live in. But researchers who study how places shape us have found over and over that the way we build our streets really does change how connected we feel. One of the most famous studies of modern American life found that as the country spread out into the suburbs and everyone started commuting alone in a car, the threads that used to tie communities together began to fray. People stopped joining clubs, stopped having neighbors over, stopped knowing the people around them. The researcher behind it, a Harvard political scientist named Robert Putnam, had a memorable way of describing the result. He said Americans had started, in effect, bowling alone. More people than ever were going bowling, he pointed out, but fewer and fewer were doing it in leagues, together. We were all still there, just each of us alone. And there is a hard physical reason that matters so much. Loneliness is not just a sad feeling, it is a genuine health risk, and the science on this is now brutally clear. Long-term isolation has been linked to higher blood pressure, weaker immune systems, depression, and a real increase in the risk of early death. The United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, recently issued a formal advisory warning that loneliness has become a full-blown public health epidemic. The data behind that warning came in large part from the work of Dr. Julianne Holt-Lunstad, a researcher at Brigham Young University, whose landmark meta-analysis found that the danger of chronic loneliness to the body is equivalent to smoking roughly 15 cigarettes a day. So, when we say the cul-de-sac was quietly rewiring the brain, that is not a figure of speech. A suburban design that removes your daily human contact is, slowly and invisibly, working against your body and your mind. There is one more layer to this, and it is the darkest one because that quiet, sealed-off street was also a tool for keeping certain people out entirely. The great post-war suburbs were not open to everyone. Many of them, including the most famous ones, were built with rules written right into the contracts that barred black families from buying in. The Federal Housing Administration itself practiced and enforced redlining, a formal policy of denying loans and backing in neighborhoods deemed racially mixed, which in practice meant that the suburban dream was, by design, a white dream. The same neighborhood design that walled a family off from casual contact also helped wall whole communities off from one another, and we are still untangling the damage that did to this country. The isolation of the cul-de-sac was never only psychological. Sometimes it was the entire point. So step back and look at the whole picture. We took the human animal, a creature that evolved over millions of years to live shoulder to shoulder in a noisy, crowded, interconnected group, and we placed it at the end of a silent, dead-end street, behind a garage door with a car as the only way out and a television as the main company. We did it with the best of intentions. We did it for safety and for space and for the kids. And it worked for those things. But we never ran the experiment on what it would do to the part of us that needs other people. And by the time the warning signs showed up, as anxiety, as the problem that has no name, as a pill in the medicine cabinet, the blueprint was already poured in concrete from coast to coast. And here is why this is not just history. You are very likely listening to this from inside that exact experiment right now. Most of America still lives in this shape. The cul-de-sac is still being built. The garage door still rolls down. And the loneliness that the planners of Radburn never imagined has become one of the defining ailments of our age, a thing our doctors now treat as seriously as a disease. The street did not do it alone, but the street is the physical record of a choice we made, the choice to trade the messy, accidental closeness of the old neighborhood for privacy and a patch of lawn. The good news is that a thing that was designed can be redesigned. Starting in the 1980s, a movement called New Urbanism set out to do exactly that. Architects like Andrés Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk built a now famous little town in Florida called Seaside, a place with narrow, walkable streets, front porches pulled close to the sidewalk, shops you can stroll to, and a town center where people actually run into each other. The whole design is a quiet argument against the cul-de-sac, an attempt to build back in all the accidental human contact that the dead-end street had engineered out, and a movement called Strong Towns, founded by a planner named Charles Marone, has spent years making the same case in more economic terms, arguing that the suburban design pattern is not just socially costly, but financially unsustainable for the cities that have to maintain all those miles of looping road. People are taking those ideas and building neighborhoods again with sidewalks that lead somewhere, with porches instead of back fences, with a reason to walk and a place to gather, and a real chance to know the people around you. So let me leave you with the question, and I really do want your answer down in the comments. Think about where you grew up or where you live right now. Do you actually know your neighbors, the people just a few doors away? Or are they strangers you wave to from the car? Be honest, because your answer might tell you more about the street you live on than you think. If this made you see your own neighborhood in a new light, stay with me, because there is a whole hidden history built into the ordinary places we walk past every day. Take care of yourself, and I will see you on the next one.